Welcome to all of you and hope you and your families are keeping safe. I will be your host today. My name is Dnyanesh Pandit. I'm a managing director with Protiviti. I look at financial services as an industry and focus on risk and compliance solutions. A few points to consider for this session. The session is recorded and will be available for people. All participant video and audio has been turned off. However, you on the right hand side of your panels, you will see two windows. One is for Q&A, where you can ask your questions during the session, and we'll pick them up towards the end of the session. And there will be another window which will open up for poll questions, which we will ask during the session as we move along. We intend to keep about 10 minutes towards the end of the session to answer questions, and we'll pick up as many as we can during those 10 minutes. If not, we will pick up those questions at a later date and respond to you individually if that works. Before we begin the session, let's set the context of the session today. I think most of you, if not all, would agree that it will be an understatement to call the last 6 months as challenging. From storms, floods, asteroids, fires, to the most damaging one of all, the COVID-19. All forms of civilizations have been affected and continue to do so even today. What has been surprising is the extent of impact that event has had on businesses worldwide. What has not been surprising, though, is the varied levels of preparedness and actions to react and deal with disruptions. Most of the organizations have taken steps to safeguard their employees, their businesses, their customers, and the customers' interests as well. This raises a very important question. Are organizations geared to adapt to what we have been calling as the new normal? The world around us has changed, be that the way we live or the way we do business. This very change calls for reimagining the way we protect and sustain our businesses and build resilience. With this note, I would like to introduce our experts on the panel today who will delve deeper on the concept of operational resilience. We have Doug Wilbert. Doug is a managing director in Protiviti's risk and compliance practice and has over 20 years of experience in financial services and capital market space. And he has also worked on large-scale consulting projects that range from financial close optimization to organization change management to large regulatory technology projects for banks, broker-dealers, and customers. These projects include work from front office operations, technology, and finance. And Doug incidentally also co-leads the Global Operational Resilience team, working with organizations to enhance their resilience in line with inflationary regulatory expectations. With Doug, we have Laura Moon. Laura is a director in Protiviti's risk and compliance practice and has 16 years of financial services experience working across multiple financial institutions to help them interpret, implement, and embed new and existing regulation. Laura co-leads the UK Operational Resilience team at Protiviti and is part of the Global Operational Resilience team as well. Laura is currently working with large, medium, and small organizations to understand the new operational resilience regulatory expectations, how they apply, and develop, implement, and programs to enhance resilience. Prior to joining Protiviti in 2015, Laura held head of audit roles at GE Capital and the Lloyds Bank. With that, over to you, Laura.
So thank you, Dnyanesh, for the introduction. So we have a jam-packed agenda for you today, and we'll be touching on a number of topics which we've shown on the slide. Ultimately, though, what we're hoping by the end of this session is that you should be able to articulate what's meant by operational resilience, understand the evolution of global regulatory focus on this topic, discuss operational resilience in the context of COVID and other real-life operational disruptions, so to bring that to life for you all a little, describe a common approach to establishing an operational resilience program, understand some of those common characteristics of a resilient organization, and lastly, be able to consider the next steps that you need to take to preempt any regulator or another third-party request on this topic. So with no further ado, I wanted to just start by touching on some of the work Protiviti's done in this space and why we feel we're in a good position to be able to talk to you today. So we've been involved in over 200 meetings on this topic now with financial institutions, regulators, trade associations, and have facilitated working sessions with over 75% of the top financial institutions globally. The aim of these meetings and sessions has been to develop and understand leading practices to address the evolving regulatory expectations and operational resilience. And we've also been meeting with non-financial institutions as well to understand and leverage good practice in those fields. We've been active in the market, so we've spoke at a number of high-profile conferences, run a number of webinars, thought leadership on the topic, which our contacts and clients have been able to leverage when they're embedding operational resilience in their organisations. And we've also established a framework which we'll be touching on later today, and worked with firms, as Dnyanesh mentioned in our introduction, to help them to interpret, understand and embed operational resilience. And in doing that, we've really leveraged some of our deep technical expertise in this space. I'm conscious today we have a great representation across different industries and different lines of defence. So I wanted just to spend a few minutes level setting what we mean by operational resilience. So operational resilience, it assumes that failure's occurred, that the event has already crystallised, and therefore the focus is really on how do you prevent that from happening again, adapt, respond to, recover and learn from that operational disruption, no matter the cause. It is an outcome, so the real focus here is on the continuity of supply of the products and services that people, businesses and the wider economy rely on most, even in the event of severe operational disruptions. And we'll discuss some real-life examples of those later on. It is different to business continuity. It's one of the questions we always get asked when we discuss this topic. And it isn't merely deploying your BCP and DR plan. For example, within BCP programs, there's no formal or constant definition of what an important business service is. Front-to-back mapping and all of the resources supporting these important business services are not comprehensively captured, and tests aren't scoped or facilitated in a manner that validates all aspects of either the function or the line of business being tested. All of these are key requirements and new requirements coming out of operational resilience. For operational resilience, there should be clear accountability. For firms in the UK, for example, the regulator has been clear that this sits with the Chief Operations Officer in the first line of defence. For non-FS firms or firms that aren't subject to the UK regulatory environment, it's really important that in your organisations you're clear on who is accountable for operational resilience. Typically this would sit with someone in the first line, and ultimately it does sit with the board, and there's real emphasis on the board understanding and owning that too. The real aim of operational resilience is that senior management truly understand where the vulnerabilities are in the most important areas of their business, and so they're able to invest in these vulnerabilities today. In doing that, the hope is that it will prevent harm tomorrow. And as I mentioned, the real focus here is on how can firms continue the supply of the products and services that people, business and the wider economy rely on the most. From a regulatory perspective, it is clear that operational resilience is a step change, and the regulators are expecting action to be taken. They will be coming to CEOs, to chairs, to boards to ask what strategic decisions and investment choices they are making to build operational resilience and to maintain that supply of important business services. For those organisations that aren't purely FS, it may be that operational resilience is more in the DNA of your organisations, but there still may be opportunities to reflect against some of the leading practices being developed and reassess in your organisations whether there's more actions you need to be taken to around strengthening operational resilience. It's also clear that it's not a one-size-fits-all, so the actions that organisations are taking to enhance operational resilience really need to be proportionate to the size and complexity of the organisation. Before I delve into this slide, we're going to open our first poll question, which hopefully you'll see in the chat window in a few moments. So if you're able to spare a couple of seconds just to answer that, that would be great. As I mentioned, operational resilience is a shift in focus, and we've sought to show on this slide how operational resilience fits in with existing practices. Just to step back and explain. So when you're at an operations level, you're tending to focus on key systems and applications, setting appropriate RTOs and RPOs for recovery. You then move out and you need to look across your firm. You need to consider your business processes, those that are supported by these critical systems and applications, understand the risks that can impact these, such as cyber, and how these fit into your BCP and DR plans. Thinking about operational resilience, that requires you to also not just be inward focused, but also outward focused, thinking about broader than just your firm, to your customers, to the impact on the wider economy, and what impact you can have if you're unable to deliver your most important business services. You need to set impact tolerances to understand the circumstances in which you cannot continue to deliver these services, and where you then start to cause intolerable harm to either your customers, yourself as a firm in terms of your ongoing viability, and also the wider economy. And there is some new terminology that we're introducing here, and Doug will talk us through those shortly. Thanks to those of you that have filled out the poll question. It's interesting to see for those that responded. So 59% do have an operational resilience program in place. That's great, but there's still 27% of you that are yet to put that in place. I'm now going to hand over to Doug, who's going to talk you through operational resilience in the news and give you some more in-depth understanding of operational resilience and the common approach to addressing that.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate you passing it on. Little feedback, let me address that. Much better. So the question is, I guess, really, how did we get here? And there's no one event that created the regulatory view of resilience. There was nothing special in the UK that made the BOE want to pull it up, and there was nothing special that made Basel respond and we anticipate a Fed respond. What there was a number of attacks globally, a number of issues globally that created the operational resilience mindset. Most recent is the Garmin attack. I don't know if you all heard about this, but Garmin, the maker of GPS and some watch technology, was the victim of a cyber attack. But to point to one cyber attack is not really going to sort of give credence to why their regulators want to address resilience. Cyber attacks, ransomware, they're a prevalent concern, but there's also the concern that a change management can create an issue. Things can go wrong. Data centers can fail. All of these things can happen and will happen eventually to a firm. So what the regulators essentially are saying is look, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Your consumers and the public at large should not be harmed because something went wrong. So what we want you to do is look at all these news events, tell us what occurred, and tell us how you're going to test your systems and what events that you're looking out for. It's very nice to say that we have really good cybersecurity. It's another thing to say we're attacked 1,000 times a day, and if we go down, we'll be down for 3 weeks. It's not contemplating the attack surface. It's not contemplating the number of times that someone tries to get into your system. What it's saying is an event has occurred. Now what do we do? So we can go to the next slide, Laura. The chronology that brought us here, we're going to start at 2017 and 18 is really when this started to become prevalent. Now, Masaryk was hit by the NotPetya virus. They had shipping containers that they had to track by Excel. Technically speaking, they were resilient at the time. I believe it was 80% of operations were still moving along, even though they didn't have their systems. So they did have some sort of backup procedure. Where resilience became a much bigger focus was in June 2018. There was a visa outage leaving in Europe a number of people unable to pay for goods and services. That was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, as we know it, for the BOE, to introduce a paper on operational resilience. Now, there's a number of other examples here where you can see Raphael's Bank, you can see COVID, you can see Garmin here as well. So resilience doesn't come in one form. It's not a contemplation of a cyber attack. It's not a contemplation of a pandemic. What it is just things are going to happen. Within the timeline, after the BOE released, the FFIEC came out with new guidelines on their BC, on their business continuity. This was, I believe, the first update in about 5 years. The OCC in 2019 said on their 2020 plan, operational resilience is going to be was their first bullet point of what they're going to go after. December 2019, we get more papers from the PRA and the FCA and the BOE. In fact, there was, I think, total of five new consultation papers on the topic, being quite prescriptive. And August, about 2 weeks ago, we got the BCBS, or the Basel Committee, view of operational resilience. So these are all financial regulators, and I recognize we have some non-financial institutions here. We're highlighting this because the financial industry is pushing along here pretty heavily. I think other industries may be a bit more mature, but we're starting to see a lot more from places like healthcare, manufacturing, and other organizations that want to start addressing this as well. Now, on the bottom, why is this important? I really hints on one thing, which is severe but plausible. Risks are always there. Events will occur, but it seems that over time, the events are becoming more severe. So what were tail events maybe 5 or 10 years ago are moving towards the mean. So what that means is that your resilience is evolving. It's not going to stay in one place. You're going to have to continue to sort of, I'll use the phrase, up your game in your resilience, because if we look just at weather, ESG is becoming a big deal. We're starting to look at weather patterns that are changing, that are affecting things that maybe 10 years ago we never saw. I know in the US side, we have weather patterns and heat indexes that we had never seen. I think we set a record a week ago for the highest temperature in the United States. So things are going to change, and they're going to continue to change to be more adverse. Who does resilience impact? On the right-hand side, in reality, everyone. Third-party providers, I highlight here. And the reason why I highlight third-party providers is, one, most firms are a third-party provider to someone else. So they have to contemplate how their downtime is going to affect their customers. But two, third-party providers, especially at larger institutions, tend to be hidden, not as prevalent, and the importance of their role within the organization is often not completely known. So I'm highlighting third-party providers here because it is probably the biggest challenge to flesh out and understand how they affect the operations of your business. As a subset of third-party providers, we can go to fourth and fifth-party providers. If you are a large institution and you use software as a service and you both have the same cloud provider, if that cloud provider goes down, your software as a service is down, and so are you. So you can't rely on just outsourcing in that manner to garner your resilience. So if we can go to the next page, Laura. So focus on COVID-19 and India challenges. We have a love-hate relationship with COVID. It's a great example of where organizations need to be resilient, but I think after 6 months of this, we're all tired of COVID. But it was interesting because in India, it pointed out some specific challenges, right? The 4G connectivity did not support work from home very well. Broadband services were an issue. The Zoom surge sort of pushed that heavily. Laptops, we had issues getting laptops, and we found some news articles that had sort of a similar issue over in India. If you think about the supply chain, it's pretty amazing that laptops would come up as a concern. So I'm going to stop here for a quick second with that introduction, and we're going to run through 2 polling questions that Laura has up. The first one is, do you believe that COVID-19 is a resilience event? And we have another 10 seconds left on that question. And once that's done, we have one more polling question to hit upon. And Laura, can you post that up?
Yeah, it's coming.
Here we go. So 91% believe it was a resilience event, 3% don't. I'm quasi in the 3%. I'm not sure, but we'll get into that in a second. But this is in line with what we find at other in other presentations. And Laura, you're going to put up the next question, please.
Yeah, I think the team are on that.
Okay, great. Excellent. So while they're pulling that up, addressing the pandemic as a resilience event. So the answer is, I think, yes, it is a resilience event, right? We have to work from home. We had to find a new way to operate. In that regard, it's a completely new sort of world. So now that we're in this new world and it is a resilience event, the issues with the pandemic. Okay, we got our next question up. Have you been able to continue to provide services uninterrupted throughout the pandemic? Is in the polling questions. So the challenge with COVID is pandemics have been planned for years. People had to put them as part of their business continuity contemplation as a pandemic. And in talking to a lot of people in the BC function, what they would say is, while you would consider this a resilience event, we've been contemplating pandemic for years. And if we just increase the number of people that would not have access to facilities, we would have nailed the pandemic perfectly. Most of these firms are financial services, and they have not had interruptions in their services. So even though they might have predicted a 70% inaccessibility, they're still doing well, even though that they're high 90s. The reason why I say this is not so much a resilience event, the pandemic was very symmetrical in how it spread. We had view that, hey, something's coming. We saw it spread starting over in China and come to the rest of the world. We had time to react. This is a very different event than if a system exploded for some reason or a data center just went on fire immediately and we couldn't transfer over. So it gave us time to respond. So while it was an event, it's not one that I think can fully test the resilience of an organization. Now, the answer to our question is, have you been able to operate without disruption? Yes, 28%. Yes, with a small impact is 64%, and no, and had a severe impact 4%. Again, I think in line with what we're seeing, that most people are able to manage the COVID response fairly well. Can we move to the next slide, please, Laura?
And I think just to add to that, Doug, what I think regulators and organisations are swiftly recognising is not to take false assurance from the fact that people have been able to respond well to COVID, because it's one type of operational disruption. And as Doug explained, there'll be lots of other types of disruptions that won't be symmetrical. They'll come fast. We won't have time to adapt. So it's important that firms do take the lessons learned from COVID-19, but equally continue on their programme to enhance operational resilience regardless of the disruption.
Thanks, Laura. So priority focus areas for managing the pandemic. I think we've all sort of been through here. Critical and essential employees. We want to know who they are, especially if they have to go to the office. We want to make sure that they can safely resume their duties. I know what I'm seeing with firms is they have a lot of protocols to get people back to office. A lot of people are not going back to office. And strangely enough, on the US side, the mantra is to stay 6 feet away. So the big question that everyone had is, well, if I work in a high rise and I have to take an elevator, how do I stay 6 feet away? It's going to take me hours to get the queue of people up to their offices. So really little things here can make really big issues. The IT infrastructure, our reliance on Zoom and Teams and WebEx has been extraordinary. But what that also means is we have new cyber attack surfaces. It means that we're using more bandwidth or more cellular, and we need to make sure we can manage it. Third-party providers, while you might have had the best intentions, your reliance on third-party providers and assuring that they're able to manage your business requirements is important. Imagine if we didn't have WebEx and Zoom, or they both went down simultaneously, things would stop. We wouldn't be able to communicate the way we do today. Sure, we'd find a new way to go through a telephone, but I don't think you realize how reliant we are upon sharing data and sharing screens until we're unable to. Finally, cyber resilience. And if the Garmin attack recently wasn't a sort of shot across the bow that we have to look out for this, the new attack surfaces and the issues of security with the new ways we interface means that a cyber event is becoming more likely, and we have to be able to recover quickly. I have one question over here in the Q&A that I just want to hit on because it does ask something very prevalent, which is, can you differentiate between enterprise risk management and operational resilience? And I want to just hit that right here quickly because we view risk management or risk, operational risk, as different than resilience. Risk is looking at let's say, the odds of an event occurring. Resilience contemplates that event occurred. How do we recover? Okay, Laura, let's move through for the sake of time, because I know we have a few more things to go through. So common approaches to resilience, evolved governance and culture. The Bank of England pushed this pretty hard. Basel pushed this pretty hard. And as a firm, we push this very hard. The governance and culture of resilience is required to come from the top of the organization. If it does not come from the top of the organization and your management has not bought in on the need for resilience, your organization will eventually fail in implementing resilience. The reason why, one is there's a culture shift where you have to look at recovery and you have to start pointing out things that can cause failure or harm. Two, resilience is not cheap. If I have to upgrade my software, if I have to a bunch of end-of-life systems, if I have to move to the cloud, there's inevitably going to be a cost to it. If you don't have buy-in from the top of the organization, it's going to be very hard to push these costs through and rationalize them to an organization where senior leadership has not bought in. Finally, the head tops of the organization need to be updated regularly on resilience because that's going to reinforce the importance of it throughout the organization. Step two, identify important business services. Inevitably, large firms don't just do one thing. They have many services. You may have a product catalog with 30 businesses. You may have a product catalog with 200. Whatever the number is, you need to break this down to bite-sized chunks so that you can actually implement this within the organization. So you have to go through and you have to understand what is important to the firm, to the firm's customers, as well as the general public itself. And what you have to do is really list these services in order of importance. If you don't, you're going to have a propensity to focus in the wrong areas and possibly spend money where it's not needed. Establish front-to-back mapping of business services. I think every regulator is in line here. If you don't know how your systems interact, if you don't know how your data flows, you're not going to know your pain points or your weak points throughout the system that are more prone to cost failure. You're also not going to know where your third-party providers sit to understand what you need from them in terms of recoverability. 4, understand intolerable harm and establish impact tolerances. Impact tolerances is a new phrase. You could view it similar to previous guidelines in the UK of MTPOD, maximum tolerable period of downtime, or FFIEC MTD. What it is essentially how long can I be down before my business service is irreparably harmed. What this is doing is putting a cost versus time of downtime and questioning your recoverability. So if you're irreparably harmed after being down for 6 hours, but you can't recover any better than 12, what it's telling you is that you need to enhance your recoverability to meet your basic mandates. Scenario test and improve is another big push by regulators. What they want you to do is run simulations, real-life simulations of extreme but plausible events to see how the firm will react to them, and then use a post-mortem, see what went right, see what went wrong, fix it, and then go back and test and improve. And they want this to be a continuous process. It's guaranteed to be iterative, but it's got to be continuous in that if we don't continue to assess and improve, you're not going to be able to address the next extreme but plausible scenario. Interestingly here, we've seen organizations where 2,000 people come in on the weekend quarterly to run tests to make sure that the resilience of the organization is acceptable. Finally, the self-assess. This is actually a regulatory mandate from the BOE, but it's also good hygiene, which is looking back and saying, am I doing the right thing here? What do I need to change? Okay, so couple of more questions came in. One is, what is the difference in operational resilience and BIAs that we create under business continuity planning? The answer is you'll still create BIAs. The BIAs will help feed the resilience. Business continuity planning is not change under resilience per se. Resilience incorporates BCP in its new world. So business continuity planning is an input into resilience. Can we move to the next slide? And I'll save some of the other questions for the end. So getting into the governance piece, we were talking about the importance here. Priority number one is the board and senior leadership. And they're responsible for the strategy, the soundness of the organization, and they're going to need to look over the rest of the organization and make sure that they are implementing resilience properly. First line, depending on your organization, you'll have a resilience in the first line or possibly the 1.5 line. Larger organizations will have a head of resilience, and this head will make sure that the organization is able to recover in an acceptable amount of time. The second line of defense will be the challenge function, much like it is presently in financial organizations. But that challenge function will come back, look at their metrics and say, hey, are we doing a good job here? What do we need to improve? Finally, the third line, audit has a huge function in resilience. We're seeing a lot of audit functions that have been engaged for years, since 2018. And early days was, do we have appropriate governance? Do we have the right culture? Audit is now going down to, how do we quantify important business services? How does our front to back mapping look? And starting to address concerns of impact tolerance, which is a pretty challenging calculation. So audit is going to take a very active role in this and is incredibly important to making sure that the soundness of the organization is there. So let's go to the next slide. So what is an important business service? So you pulled this, this is a hybrid, mostly taken from the Department of Homeland Security for the US, and it is financial services related up top, as you can see. And they break it up to financial services and then economic functions, with the bottom is where I want to go to, because I think this is more important for a diverse crowd. There are business services that cross over all of these financial services: payments, pricing services, market data, reference data. There's infrastructure that crosses across all this: energy, communications, IT, as well as shared platforms. So this is pulled from financial services because that's generally where we work with resilience, because the regulatory purview there. And we broke it down pretty detailed up top. We can do this for pharma, we can do this for manufacturing, we can do this for data providers. What this is really saying is, break down the services you provide, but don't forget the services that you utilize, right? We all need communications in order to act as a firm. And that goes back to my comments earlier about Zoom, WebEx, and Teams. We all need to know where our third parties are. Cloud providers are taking a much more prevalent stake as a critical third party. So if you're not in financial services, this type of chart is important to understand what could be critical for your business. Another good place to go here is the product catalog of your firm. If you have all of your offerings listed at a high level and then sub-levels, and you compare it back here, you should be able to do a good job of understanding what's important and what's not.
I'd like to add, Doug, with this one, I think the regulators, with all of this, I think the regulators learning as much as the industry. So they have said, what's almost as important here is the homework. So how have you actually approached, what's your methodology that supports how you've determined what your important business service is, arguably more important than the resulting end list. It isn't meant to be a once in a lifetime assessment either. You're expected to continually assess whether you have really understood and identified those services that are most important to the firm's survival, to your customers, and to the wider economy.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so important business services framework. For the sake of time, I'm not going to run into much detail here. But what I do want to do is just show how this is bifurcated. And what we do is we're looking at impact for the wider financial system on the firm and on the customer and the client. What this is really showing is that resilience is not, we're not looking inward at our ability to withstand an event only. And you may look at some stress testing scenarios and say, hey, can we withstand an event and still be financially viable, especially after the 2008 crisis in financial services? What this is saying is you need to understand your impact more broadly than your organization, how you affect others, and take that into account on your recoverability. For example, if your firm could be down for days and withstand it from a revenue perspective because you have enough money sort of packed away, but you cause systemic harm on the wider financial system, regulators would deem that as unacceptable. And they're going to say that the critical criteria you must meet on your recoverability is that the financial system cannot handle you being down for more than X number of hours. The harm to the client is a very UK-centric view as well as European-centric view. And what they're saying there is that same harm that could be done on the wider financial system, while it's not as messy, if it's on the customer, you still have to take into account the customer harm that you may cause. So that would be going over towards reputational and regulatory fines. But the idea is when you create your important business service is that you have an outward-facing lens and contemplate whom you're important to. It's not just the firm that's important under resilience, it's all the stakeholders of the goods and services that the firm provides. If we can go to the next one. So here we have a poll question coming up. How important do you feel third-party relationships are to operational resilience? And while we contemplate this, I'll take the minute and just briefly go through the slide because I have spoken to it. The continuous improvement is a big piece that regulators have looked at, and they are requiring you to have extreme but plausible scenarios in your testing. They're requiring you to have enhanced testing. They want you to take the feedback and give tangible improvements and prove it, and they want you to self-assess. So what they're really doing is saying, barring a live scenario, this is the best way we can look and see how you perform. So go ahead and conduct these tests. How regularly you conduct them, how stringent, how real time is going to be a function of how important the business service is. So the link back there is critical. But under the first heading here, design scenario, if you don't create extreme but plausible events, you're not hitting the need for resilience. So you need to make sure that you contemplate a hurricane, a system outage, a cloud provider outage, a electrical grid outage. All of these things need to come in. You need to gauge under the conduct the test. If it's conducted in silos, it will fail. The more bodies you can bring in for the test, the more real life you can make it, the better. And finally, the lessons learned. You need to look back and say, what did we do good? What did we do bad? And you need to look at it from a realistic lens, not just say, okay, we failed and not make an improvement. Regulators will frown upon that. Answering the poll question before I hand it back to Laura, how important do you feel the third-party relationships are? Again, very much in line with other polls we've taken here, critical, important, hit the top two. And I would agree there for most organizations. So Laura, I'll hand it back to you to finish up and then we can get over to QA.
Great, thanks, Doug. We're aware that we've got good representation today from the third line of defence as well, so we just wanted to quickly touch on internal audit's role and providing assurance. Just Doug had a brief intro on this. I think what we're really seeing here is the first step for audit is to really partner with the first and second line to understand how the organisation is structuring their operational resilience programme, to know when and how audit can best add value. So there's a real need to be involved at the start, and I think there's also a need to be involved in educating the business. So as they're developing their thinking, as they're documenting these new key concepts, articulating what you'd expect to see as an audit function to be able to provide an appropriate assurance opinion is really important. Because when we've worked with firms, we've seen that maybe the documentation's lacking. So although they may have done the good work, they haven't been able to evidence it. So that's really important to work with the organisation as well to articulate what you'd be expecting to see. I think Doug mentioned we typically see internal audit reviews starting with governance, but those that are now more mature have started auditing those new key concepts. So have you mapped the processes in enough depth and understood them? How have you actually determined your important business services? Have you considered the right factors in doing so? How well documented and repeatable and robust is that methodology? Have you really understood the impact tolerances and articulated them in an appropriate way? And flipping to the testing as well, what's the robustness of those severe but plausible tests that have been established? And are firms really taking those lessons learned into the organisation to improve continually? We'll be happy to share some more insights on how to audit and audit approaches in future for anyone that's interested, but for time, I'm just going to skip on. Thanks, Doug, for your detailed explanation of all the operational resilience and new concepts. It's using these insights and our understanding that we've sought to build the framework that you see on screen now. We've used this framework with a number of our clients to complete anything from the maturity assessment around their operational resilience, help them structure how they need to be thinking about operational resilience, develop their programs, and an equally deep dive into some of these areas as well, bringing some of those real key industry insights into a number of these areas. We have another poll question. If you could please answer that whilst I skip on through to the last slide. We really wanted to end the presentation by highlighting a number of the key characteristics that we've observed in firms which are managing operational resilience well. And as with any outcome, achieving it is as much about the culture of the organisation and the way in which they approach a new challenge, seek to get things done proactively, collaboratively, as well as those kind of building blocks. I think if you sit back and think of your firm, if you can hand on heart say, you can see and demonstrate these characteristics, you're probably, a large way on your journey to actually being operationally resilient. For the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these characteristics, so I want to make sure we've got enough time for Q&A. I'm just going to touch on a couple. Reflecting on COVID, almost every single individual we've spoken to when we've reflected on what went well or what was a real key differentiator in managing that crisis, effective communications was key. Comms needed to be provided at the right time, the right frequency, with the right tone, clear messages both internally and externally from that exec, so people really knew what their priorities were in that crisis and they could move as one to achieve those. And I find it interesting and good that comms are now also part of that scenario testing, so organisations need to test throughout that scenario how robust and how effective their communication strategies are both internally and externally. I also just wanted to pick up on the robust ecosystem, and that matches as well to really understanding your important business processes and the underlying resources that support those. So, and this includes third parties as well. It's in really understanding and making sure that you have a robust ecosystem. Again, it helps individuals to truly understand what's important and what they need to focus at the right time and when. Agile and rapid response, so the ability to react to incidents due to a variety of causes, regardless of the speed, scale and symmetry, and deal with them quickly to prevent them moving into a crisis is critical. And many firms have talked about the desire to bottle the culture, bottle the responsiveness that they had and saw as a response to COVID-19 and not go back to operating in silos. And lastly, I just want to call out the lessons learned. Incidents really need to be seen as an opportunity to learn as opposed to evidence of success. And for any organisation to really achieve this outcome, there needs to be a culture of continuous learning, of continuous improvement from those scenarios and from those real life major incidents to improve and understand how to prevent, recover, adapt, respond and learn from any operational resilience event. So So I think just answering the poll question, how much of an impact do you expect in your operational resilience expectations globally to have on your business? It's good to see that no one said no impact, and there's a variety there, and that may be based on what industry you're in, where you already are with your own operational resilience program, how many third parties you rely on, etc. So that's an interesting spread. So thank you. I think that's it in terms of a presentation. We just wanted to make sure there was a few minutes left for Q&A.
Thanks, Laura and Doug. I think very insightful in terms of the concept itself. We have some interesting questions pop up, some relevant to the topic that you touched upon also. Let me pick up the first one on the. Do you feel it would be difficult to develop a positive risk culture in the new normal of work from home? I know we touched upon risk culture on different slides with two different contexts. Maybe some thoughts around this?
So I think it's difficult? No, I think that management needs to be continually engaged. I know at our firm, they send out regular emails, regular updates. In our New York office, our New York region, the woman who's in charge of the New York region actually has a call every Monday for 30 minutes. So I think in regard, you can create a positive risk culture. And I think also, let's not forget that we're home because of a resilience event, and that's a pretty strong enforcement right there. That you need to contemplate risk and need to understand that things will happen.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that to say that I think there's a lot of reflection for management, particularly during COVID. They've had to make certain decisions, and I think there's question marks over whether in making those decisions, they've really truly understood the potential risk impact. So I think there is the need, now the crisis management is over, to step back and truly understand the risks that firms have taken in those decisions. There's been questions, for example, to the regulator, where there's been regulatory forbearance, whether that will continue. And I think it's been quite clear that where that regulatory forbearance has meant a speeding up of certain activity, which would have happened anyway, then yes. But where that regulatory forbearance has resulted in a significant change to risk appetite, it's very unlikely that that will continue. So I think risk culture, there may be, I guess, a drawing back of some of those risks that we've seen that have been needed due to the response to COVID.
Thanks, Laura. Got another one which talks about the time frame. What, according to you, is the time frame to implement an end-to-end operational resilience framework?
So financial regulators have given, I think it's 2 years from now. But the reality is that depending on your firm, that may or may not be realistic. If you have a lot of technology and you're relying heavy on data centers, for example, it may take that long to get a strategy together and actually update. So I don't think that there's a particular time frame. I think starting to incorporate into your daily routines and into the DNA of your business would be, let's start that today. But this is not something that ends, right? You don't hit a point and say, I'm now resilient. This is a continual refresh and looking at the organization, technology strategy, people strategy. So there's a continuous improvement component to this for sure.
And I think when you think about timeframes as well, it's not just the timeframes in terms of embedding these new concepts that we've articulated today. There's also a timeframe question around when you actually identify vulnerabilities, how long does it take you to fix and address those? And there's definitely a movement, particularly where it's things like IT legacy systems and things like that, that there will need to be a big investment in that. And the response of it's cost too much is unlikely to be an acceptable response. So I think there'll be a focus on how quickly firms are able to plug those vulnerabilities impacting their most important business services, as well as a focus on how quickly can you kind of get through the new key concepts that the regulator is moving towards.
No, absolutely. And Doug, you also talked about scenarios earlier. How different are these scenarios that we talk about from a resilience perspective compared to what we have heard about in the operational management framework?
So I'm sorry, the last piece, when we hear you're talking about like scenarios versus stress testing scenarios?
Yeah.
Yeah. So There's going to be similarities. The outcome that we're looking for and the data that we want back from the scenarios is different. If you're looking at, for example, on the US side, CCAR, and you're looking at operational risk, and you're looking at scenarios that created or cause problems with risk, you're looking at the viability from a financial perspective. What we're looking at here is from a recoverability perspective, and while they're related, the outcome that we're looking for is different. So, is there possible usability of a scenario? Sure. Is that how I want to develop my operational resilience scenarios? Probably not. I want to take a look at the important business. I want to take a look at a whole host of other things, as opposed to a stress testing scenario, which is a bit more prescriptive. The resilience gives you much more room to understand your organization and see what scenarios are best for you to sort of look at. But the outcome is inherently different, right? We're looking at recoverability. We're not looking at financial stress.
I also think with resilience, the key part of the scenarios is to try and understand when you can't meet your impact tolerance. So it's kind of not acceptable to set your impact tolerance, run a scenario, and realise that you can meet them and it's kind of job done. It's how do you stress and worsen that scenario so you do understand the circumstances in which you're unable to meet your impact tolerance.
Yep, makes sense. Sorry, I was saying, you also mentioned about the fact that the responsibility lies on the first line, and that's a big responsibility. Have you, in your experiences, could you describe some of the roles that the individuals or the functions who are responsible for resilience need to play?
I didn't quite hear that properly, I don't think, sorry.
So the question was, are there any specific roles that you can share with us in terms of the responsibility on the resilience officers or the resilience function within an organization from your experience?
So there's generally, at larger firms, there'll be a resilience office. The resilience office will own certain functions. For example, they may own crisis management, communications. The BC function may report into them. So will disaster recovery. So that office and that function are becoming a new role throughout financial institutions, especially. But in terms of resilience, it's you don't need that office to manage resilience. It's just helpful to wrap everything together. If you start to look at recovery in a slightly different fashion and move away from application and systems and to business services, you're addressing a big piece of resilience. But it's really just an enhancement of all the recoverability methods and roles that we've been having prior.
Yeah, and I think there's clearly a linkage there between, so in the UK, for example, the regulator specifies that it's the Chief Operations Officer, it's the SMF 24, but that's one senior management function that can actually be split, and it's quite often split with technology, so CTO. So there's a clear linkage there. When you're talking about recoverability, it needs to be operations and technology working on this together.
We've got one more question, which goes, do you see companies including climate risk into their emerging risk data?
Yeah, so climate risk is becoming a huge deal. And climate risk is one of the big pieces of testing that we put in. Simple example, it used to be if you put your data centers, let's say 200 miles away, you're good. Hurricane Sandy in the US changed all that, right? Because it ran right up the East Coast, and whether you were in New York or New Jersey, it didn't matter. It caused the same amount of destruction. So climate change is a big deal. Floods are becoming more prevalent. Natural disasters, if we'll call them collectively, are becoming more prevalent and more common. So how do you incorporate that, for example, into data center strategy? How do you incorporate that into accessibility to offices? All of this needs to be contemplated and addressed. That's one of the more difficult ones, because it's sort of like, well, how are the weather patterns going to affect me when they're ever changing? It's a tough one to address, but certainly one that you need to contemplate in your scenarios.
Perfect. I think We've got one question more to go. We've got another minute to go, so let's make the most of it. There still continues to be a lot of variation in how BIAs are done in different organizations and lack of an objective methodology around the same. Do you think there should be a consistent way to do this, and can this be driven consistently across organizations?
You want to take this one, Laura?
Yeah, so I think the regulations and I think our regulatory timeline also showed that there's a lot of focus on the foundational elements that support operational resilience. So that's business continuity and disaster recovery, as well as cyber. So I do think there's a driver to try and get consistency, and there's a lot of industry bodies that are also working towards doing the same. There is a need, though, to make sure that whatever methodologies come out need to be proportionate to the size and complexity of the organisation, which I think is why regulators are on the side of, look, here's the principles we're looking for you to develop here, but we don't want to tell you how to do it to the nth degree, because you need to be able to understand what's most suitable for your particular business. So I think although there's a driver towards it, I don't ever think there'll be enough prescription there that it's absolutely cross the I's and dots the T's across every type of organisation and every type of industry.
Sorry, I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but there is one last question that seems interesting. If that's okay, we can pick that up. How will identifying grey rhinos help us be prepared and address operational resilience events?
Not one I can take, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I missed that question.
How will identifying grey rhinos help us be prepared and address operational resilience events?
Gray rhinos.
Anomalies,
Sure. Sure. So, how will identifying anomalies? I think that the regulatory advice, to sum it up, is you don't know where a challenge is going to come from, so just be prepared for things that are going to happen. I'll take a cyber event. Cyber events are evolving. They're becoming more, in theory, they should be becoming more destructive, more sophisticated. So what was a cyber event 5-10 years ago today probably would be a non-event. So what does the cyber event look like in the future? If you don't start preparing for these things that seem implausible, when they become plausible, you're not going to be prepared for them.
Absolutely.
And I think COVID's a good example of that. I think a lot of firms would say it was on the tail end of their emerging risks, and they wouldn't necessarily have thought to do in-depth scenario planning and testing around that. It's now happened. So I think that is making firms think differently around some of those tail events that they wouldn't necessarily have actually either tested, or if they have tested, really invest and take the action they need to take to be able to manage that event if it did occur. So yeah, there's a shift in thinking, but also with an eye on not having scenario paralysis.
Good. I think this brings us to the close of the session. I think it has been an interesting session. Very interesting questions from the audience as well. There are a few which are unanswered, which we'll pick up and individually respond to them. A big thank you to you, Doug and Laura, for making it happen for us here. And a big thank you for all the participants for making it to the session today. Thank you again, and stay safe.
Thank you.